Why does the image of the father hold such power over our lives, shaping how we see authority, discipline, and even ourselves? Carl Jung believed the father archetype is not just a personal memory, but a universal force within the psyche. It can either guide us towards strength or keep us bound in fear. Today, you are invited to uncover this inner figure and claim the path of self-possession, where true authority is found within. Carl Jung described the father archetype as one of the most significant forces within the collective unconscious, a pattern that shapes how human beings relate to authority, structure, and guidance. When we speak of the role of the father archetype in psychology, we are not merely talking about a literal father, but about a symbolic presence that influences the way we develop responsibility and order in our lives. Jung emphasized that this archetype carries with it both protective and directive qualities. In its positive form, the father archetype is the voice that calls us to discipline, that sets boundaries, and that awakens in us the courage to step into the world with clarity and purpose. It becomes the inner lawgiver, the principle that transforms chaos into structure. Without some recognition of this archetypal figure, individuals often struggle with confusion, indecision, and a sense of being unanchored. The absence or distortion of the father archetype leaves the psyche vulnerable to disorder, where boundaries are either too weak or too rigid. Jung saw that this symbolic father plays a role beyond the family. It emerges in teachers, leaders, religious figures, and cultural institutions. Each carries the imprint of the father archetype, whether nurturing growth or imposing limitation. The healthy presence of this figure instills a sense of accountability and direction, while its absence creates a longing for external authority to fill the void. In both cases, the psyche reveals its dependence on this archetypal pattern. Jung taught that to truly mature, one must internalize the father archetype, turning the external symbol into an inner strength. Only then does the individual cease to depend entirely on outer authority and begin to cultivate self-possession, the ability to govern one's own life with both responsibility and freedom. Carl Jung often emphasized that the father archetype holds a dual nature, carrying both creative and destructive potential. On one side, it provides structure, guidance, and authority that can foster confidence and discipline. On the other, it can become oppressive, rigid, and stifling when it manifests in its shadow form. Jung explained that the father archetype and authority in the psyche are deeply connected. Authority is not only something we encounter in the external world, but also an inner voice that shapes how we govern ourselves. The shadow side of the father archetype emerges when this authority transforms into domination. Instead of offering direction, it imposes restrictions that suffocate individuality. A person heavily influenced by the shadow father may live under constant judgment, always feeling as if they are not enough or must live up to impossible expectations. This is the negative inheritance of the archetype, one that breeds fear rather than freedom. Jung pointed out that these dynamics are not simply learned behaviors from actual parents, but are rooted in the collective unconscious, recurring across cultures and history as a universal pattern. Recognizing this shadow side is essential because it reveals how easily authority can become distorted. For some, this distortion leads to rebellion against all authority figures, while for others, it creates submission and dependency. In either case, the individual remains unfree, trapped by projections of the archetype rather than guided by its deeper wisdom. Jung believed that confronting the shadow father requires courage, for it means facing the parts of ourselves that still fear authority, that still seek approval, or that still recoil under judgment. Only by making this unconscious force visible can we begin to transform its power from oppressive dominance into a constructive inner authority that strengthens rather than diminishes. Carl Jung observed that the father archetype is most clearly revealed in what he called the father complex, the psychological imprint left by the symbolic father figure within the psyche. This complex is not confined to our relationship with the literal father, though that relationship often triggers it, but reflects how the archetype operates unconsciously in shaping our adult lives. When the father complex is unresolved, it colors the way individuals relate to authority, achievement, and even intimacy. Some may struggle with submission, constantly seeking validation from external authority figures, while others may rebel against any form of structure, unable to accept guidance without perceiving it as domination. Jung explained that this ambivalence arises because the father archetype carries both positive and negative poles. The positive father archetype empowers through wisdom, providing a sense of security and guidance that allows the individual to grow with confidence. The negative father archetype, however, judges harshly, instills fear, and fosters dependence or resentment. This polarity often appears in relationships, where partners unconsciously project father images onto each other, expecting either protection or control. Careers, too, are influenced by the father complex, as many people unconsciously choose professions or mentors that echo their unresolved struggles with authority. Even in spiritual life, the archetype of the father may distort how one perceives God, transforming the divine into either a benevolent guide or a punitive judge. Jung insisted that these patterns are not merely personal but archetypal, arising from the collective unconscious and repeating across cultures and histories. The challenge lies in withdrawing these projections, in recognizing that the authority we seek or resist outside ourselves reflects an inner dynamic. By confronting the father complex, an individual begins the work of integrating the archetype, moving away from unconscious repetition and toward conscious self-possession. Carl Jung believed that the work of individuation required the conscious integration of archetypal figures, and the father archetype was central to this task. He explained that true maturity comes when a person no longer relies solely on external authority, but develops an inner father figure, a symbolic presence of guidance and discipline within the psyche. Integrating the father archetype means taking the qualities once projected onto parents, leaders, or institutions and internalizing them as personal strengths. This process does not mean rejecting external authority altogether, but transforming dependence into self-governance. In Jungian psychology, the inner father provides the courage to face challenges, the discipline to maintain boundaries, and the clarity to make decisions rooted in wisdom rather than fear. Without this integration, individuals remain caught in cycles of dependency or rebellion, forever reacting to authority instead of embodying it. Jung noted that this movement towards self-possession is not easy, for it requires confronting the fear of responsibility and the temptation to remain in the comfort of external structures. Yet, when the father archetype is brought into consciousness, it becomes a source of stability and empowerment rather than oppression. The individual begins to carry authority within, acting with integrity even in the absence of external approval. This is what Jung called self-possession, the ability to direct one's life from an inner center that is strong, balanced, and free. It is the transformation of the father archetype from an outer figure into an inner compass. When this happens, the psyche no longer feels bound by the demands of the past or the projections of society. Instead, the symbolic father becomes a living principle within, guiding the person toward responsibility, strength, and authenticity. For Jung, this integration was not optional, but essential for the journey to wholeness. Carl Jung taught that the father archetype is more than a personal memory. It is a universal force that shapes how we relate to authority, discipline, and guidance. In exploring its role, we have seen how it provides structure in the psyche, how its shadow can oppress and distort, how the father complex influences relationships and careers, and how integration leads to true self-possession. Jung insisted that these archetypal powers, when left unconscious, rule us as fate, but when brought into awareness, they become sources of strength. The task is not to reject authority, but to transform it, to carry within ourselves the inner father as a principle of responsibility, clarity, and integrity. In doing so, we move beyond dependence and rebellion into maturity, where authority is no longer an external burden but an inner compass. This is the path to self-possessions, living not as fragments directed by hidden forces, but as whole beings who embody their own guiding principle. For Jung, this was the essence of individuation, the freedom of becoming who we truly are.